James's life had been spiraling for months. At work, he was overlooked, mocked by his co-workers, Terry, Buddy, and Ron, all scheming to steal the promotion he desperately needed. Their boss, Tim, a smug, power-hungry megalomaniac, did nothing but harass and demean him. His girlfriend, Erica, once his only solace, had begun to look at him differently, with pity and frustration in her eyes. But the real horror began at night, when the Nekrogod started to visit his dreams. The creature was a monstrous, human-shaped figure, its head a TV screen made of pale, pulsating flesh, its static-laced voice seeping into James's mind like poison. In each nightmare, the Nekrogod whispered the same message: "Become me, or let me become you. Become one. Become Nekrogod." The dreams grew more intense, the Nekrogod's influence more invasive. James would wake up sweating, feeling the ache of static in his head, seeing his TV flicker with twisted reflections of his own face, eyes wide and terrified, staring back at him. One night, James finally gave in. The screen flickered, pulsing like a heartbeat, and as his hand reached toward it, his fingers pressed against the screen, but instead of feeling cold glass, they sank into warm, wet flesh. He tried to pull away, but it was too late. Tendrils of static and sinew coiled around his arm, pulling him in. His face twisted in horror as his skin melted into the screen, merging with the Nekrogod. Flesh, plastic, and wire fused painfully into him, his bones reshaping, his blood turning to static. When he awoke, James was different. By day, he was still himself, but by night, he became the Nekrogod. The transformation brought a terrible power. Through his flesh-bound screen, James could now invade others' minds, dragging them into twisted, hellish nightmares, and he knew exactly who deserved his wrath. First was Terry, who mocked him at work. That night, Terry dreamed of being strapped to an operating table in a sterile room, his eyes forced open as a screen flickered above him. James's face appeared, grinning, while wires slithered into Terry's mouth, eyes, and ears. He screamed, but his voice was swallowed by static as the screen injected the techno-neurovirus into his mind, filling him with endless visions of twisted, tortured bodies. Buddy was next, trapped in a maze of endless TV screens, each one showing James's face, smiling wider with each step. Buddy tried to run, but every screen he passed reached out with skeletal, flesh-covered arms, pulling him deeper into the maze until he was swallowed by static, his mind trapped in a loop of horror. Ron found himself bound in a nightmare where his own body started to change. He looked down as his skin peeled away, revealing cables and flesh fused together, his bones twisting into steel rods. He felt his mind being sucked out of his body, trapped in the static of his own nightmare, helpless as James watched, laughing. James saved Tim, his boss, for last. In Tim's nightmare, he sat at his desk, smugly reading through files, when his computer screen flickered, the image distorted, replaced by the face of the Nekrogod, James's face, now horrifically twisted, eyes dark pits oozing static. Tim tried to scream, but his mouth was filled with wires that slithered down his throat. His skin began to tighten, cracking as his own flesh turned into a thick, heavy screen, trapping him as a lifeless display of nightmares. Erica, the only one who had shown him kindness, was not spared. Her dream was different, a room filled with James's distorted face on every wall. "I'm strong now, Erica," he whispered through the speakers, his voice breaking with static. Aren't I everything you wanted?" She tried to run, but the room closed in, the walls pressing tighter, his face laughing, twisted with a love that had turned to malice. It was all done now. A dark fate had befallen everyone who was a thorn in James's path. James sat alone in a dark room, dim neon lights casting an eerie glow, bathing everything in a sickly red and green haze. In front of him, a television flickered, static hissing softly, illuminating his face with a ghostly pallor. His eyes were sunken, hollow, his skin pale and stretched. The toll of his revenge carved deep into his features. On the screen, the Nekrogod stared back at him, its face a grotesque mirror of his own, grinning as it pulsed with life. "So," the Nekrogod whispered through the speakers, its voice thick with static, curling into James's mind. "How does it feel, James, to finally be free?" James swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're all gone. Terry, Buddy, Ron, even Tim. They're lying in hospital beds, empty shells. Because of me. I did this." The Nekrogod's mouth twitched, its twisted smile widening. "You did. They are paying the price for every sneer, every insult, every moment of suffering they gave you." The screen pulsed, the static intensifying as it leaned closer. "Isn't this what you wanted?" James's eyes dropped to his hands, still trembling. He thought of Erica, how she'd looked at him with pity that last night before she too had vanished into his web of nightmares. Now she lay like the rest, hooked to machines, lost in endless dreams of horror that he'd woven. They were cruel, James said, his voice unsteady. They deserved it, right? The Nekrogod laughed, a warped, grating sound that echoed in the small room. They did, but that's not why you did it. The creature's voice lowered, filling James's ears like a feverish whisper. You did it because I made you strong. You let me in because you wanted power. And now, the screen flickered, darkened, and James saw his own face reflected back, staring into empty eyes he barely recognized. Now you are strong. James felt his heartbeat slow, his mind numb. But if they're all gone, if there's no one left to pay... He looked up at the Nekrogod, his voice quivering. What happens to me? The Nekrogod leaned forward, filling the screen, its fleshy, distorted head swelling and stretching. You wanted to become me, James. It purred, its grin widening until its mouth seemed to swallow the screen. Now you will be, forever. The static grew louder, drilling into James's head until he could feel his own thoughts shattering, fragmenting into an endless buzz of white noise. The last thing he saw before everything went dark was the screen, the Nekrogod's face melting and twisting until there was nothing but his own reflection, smiling back, eyes hollow. James opened his mouth to scream, but his voice dissolved into static. Now, there was only the screen, broadcasting endless nightmares to anyone who dared to sleep. And in the hospital, 5 patients lay still, their dreams haunted by a face that had once been James.